Hey guys, welcome to the I Hope They Hear This podcast. And we are in my home office for the first time since I started doing the videos. And I debated for a long time whether or not I would have a video for this episode. But for the sake of consistency, I said yes. And I realized that it's awkward because it's just a camera pointed at me. And I didn't want this to be where I just stared into the camera, making the viewer uncomfortable. So I actually have Iron Man 2 playing in the background here on this TV. And I'm going to be looking at this. So if there are moments where I trail off or if I lose focus, it's because something is happening and I'm too focused on the video. This is probably not the best way to record a podcast, but this was the only solution I knew of to circumvent the awkwardness of having the video or having to constantly look at the camera. Although I'm sure I'll do it occasionally. But yeah, welcome to my office. I have 3 posters here. There's one you're not seeing. The first one is stylized DC superheroes. The second one is I believe it's a Joker. Was a cover of Joker on one of the old Batman comic books. And I have the third one that you can't see is very similar to the first one, but it's stylized Marvel superheroes. The reason why you're not seeing it is because the light hitting the poster makes a glare, and I didn't want that annoyance for the viewers. So I shifted it so that you can't see it. I also have my treadmill here because I am health conscious, and there are times I like to walk or run while I am working. Or I'm not working. Yeah. So this is my office. Yeah. So if you are not subscribed to my YouTube channel yet, then it would behoove you to do so that you can watch awesome videos like this. And who knows, there might be things in the future that are video exclusive. Who knows? Hint, hint. Yeah. So welcome to the I Hope They Hear This podcast. I don't know if I started with that or not. Again, I'm already being distracted by the movie playing here. By the way, if for those people saying that Iron Man 2 was a bad movie, I disagree. I think it's good fun. It's not Citizen Kane, obviously, but you get to see a lot. There's a lot of things that happen. And the drone battle at the end, it's great. I don't know why so many people had issues with it. But anyways, I digress. This is the 52nd episode of the I Hope They Hear This podcast. And that means that this is the last episode of the year-long commitment that I made. So when I first started this podcast, I said, let me try this podcasting for a year on a weekly basis and see where it takes me. And without that commitment, I'm sure, knowing my personality, I would have simply stopped somewhere along the line when I got bored with it. But I'm really glad I pushed through, because in pushing through, I feel like I was able to take it in different directions and really find things that I liked talking about. I found a lot of things I enjoyed in terms of the formatting of the podcast. So yeah, I'm really glad that I went through with it. So I thought that I would take this episode as a chance to kind of recap the year, talk about the things I liked, talk about the things I didn't like, and talk about, things I learned along the way. So first thing I want to talk about is what I learned about myself. I feel like I learned a lot about myself. I mentioned this several times throughout the course of the podcast, but when I wrote my 2 books on, the titles were The Awkward Introvert Survival Guide. First one was about surviving parties. Second one was about surviving job interviews. But while I was writing those books, my wife made the comment that she thought that I was becoming more of an introvert, more of a shy guy And she says that this podcast is what kind of brought me back or made me more outgoing. And I completely agree with that. I think that makes sense. I think that's true. And the thing I learned about myself is that I don't necessarily dislike talking with people. It's that I dislike small talk. And because this is a podcast, there isn't a whole lot of small talk involved. And I found myself kind of enjoying talking with people, which is a stance that I wouldn't have taken prior to this. So, yeah, what I learned about myself is that these meaningful conversations where I am learning about other people and unearthing their stories, it's really great. It's really awesome. If you go back to the episode I did with Connor regarding passion, I forget what episode number that was, but I talked about how I wasn't sure what my passion was. At one point, I thought it was writing. At one point, I thought it was just, actually, that might have been it. But what I'm realizing in just kind of exploring it and talking to people, I think my passion might be curating stories and cataloging stories, whatever you want to call it. I like hearing people's stories and telling stories. So whatever medium it took, I think I enjoyed writing because it was telling a story through the written text. And I enjoy this podcast because I'm able to tell stories in audio format. And so, yeah, I'm still exploring. I won't say definitively that that's my passion because it's still relatively new. But if someone asked me the question and I needed to give an answer, yeah, that's it. I think my passion is curating stories. And I have this podcast to thank for it, because if I had stopped doing this podcast midway through, I don't think I would have figured it out. Right. So next I want to talk about what I liked about this podcast. And one of the things I learned kind of near the second half of the year is that this podcast somehow gives me this sense of authority in terms of asking specific questions to people. So without this podcast, without having a mic in front of me and in front of someone else, I don't think I would feel comfortable asking the questions that I did ask to my guests in a normal, regular conversational setting. So that's what I really enjoyed. I mean, I talked about how I learned that I enjoy talking to people, but what I like about the podcast is that it gives me a reason. I don't know. It allows me to have deeper conversations with people that I normally wouldn't have. And one example of that is if you go back to the episode with Captivated, that's only like 3 episodes ago. But I kind of challenge him about, what do you like, design or music? Are you sure you like design more? Are you sure you don't really like music more, but you're gravitating toward design just because you feel like you're better at it? I don't know if I would have been able to challenge Edward in that way in a normal setting if it wasn't for the podcast. Another one is, if you go back to the episode, this is several episodes back, but the episode where Chuni of Zealand came on, I was able to challenge him about reaching out to his dad. And that I wasn't even ever really comfortable asking him about his dad, but I was able to. For some reason, I felt like the podcast gave me authority to ask those questions. So I found out something new about Chuni that I never knew before. I actually didn't know if his dad was in his life or not, but I asked him the question, and I was able to even challenge him a little bit in saying, man, it would be great if you reconciled with your father. And yeah, I don't know. There's something about the podcast. I guess it's because it's a platform. It gives me a sense of I'm able to do this. I'm able to dig deeper than I normally would. So that's one thing I really like about the podcast. I really liked the episode with Andy. In fact, actually, I mentioned this in my last episode, but the episode I did with Andy on anxiety is currently the most listened to episode on this podcast. And I can see why, because it really is a relevant topic. I think it's something that a lot of people are going through, and it's something that no one really talks about normally in everyday conversation. It's weird to bring up the fact that you're anxious about something. It's weird to bring up the fact that you might be depressed a little bit. So being able to talk about that with Andy really helped me personally. I think being able to identify the root of my anxiety has been awesome. And I'll talk about that later. Yeah. I'll talk about that later, and I'll tell you where I talk about that. But that's just a hint, not, yeah, hint. But anyways, so, yeah, that was weird. Sorry, I was trying to be coy, and I was trying to allude to things to come in the future. But being able to identify where my anxiety was coming from, I think really helped me. That fact alone gave me some peace of mind, because I thought that it made no sense for someone like me someone like me in my position and all the advantages I have in my life to be anxious about anything. But after talking with Andy and being able to identify where that was coming from, it really did, it at least helped me in the sense that I knew that there was a reason for it, that it wasn't for no reason. So yeah, that really helped. And yeah, I think being able to open up about that was great, because I'm hoping, at least for Hyun, it did, my previous guest in the very previous episode. He talked about how he was able to talk to Andy about his stuff. He got coaching from Andy regarding his anxiety. So I'm really hoping that there are more of you out there who was able to kind of think about anxiety that might have been in, that you might have been going through, and no longer afraid to bring it up, or no longer trying to push it aside, but really saying, yeah, this is something that I do need to talk to someone about, or at least just think about and figure out. So that was a really great episode, and that was something that I would have never been able to do without the podcast, right? I can't think of another way that I would have had enough influence, I would say. So I'm not saying that I have influence over people, but there are people listening now to me that I didn't have listening to me before the podcast. So the fact that I have a platform to talk about and discuss these things has been great, because I'm able to help people understand that they're not just going through it alone. Yeah. So that's the second thing that I like about the podcast. And the third thing I really like about this podcast is, I guess this is the reason I started it, but I'm able to talk about things that I think are very important, but people don't really know about. One of the most feedback I got on the single episode was the midweek episode I did with Target, because I talked about how Target does some shady things with their pricing, how the price on their shelves it shows, like, for example, a desk at Target might show $100 at the shelf, but once you bring it to the counter to ring up, it shows like 130. And they know that this is happening, but they're not doing anything about it. So you have to be the one to say, hey, the price is different on the shelf, and they'll change it for you. But if you don't talk about it, if you don't say anything about it, then you can leave the store having paid $30 more than you did. So when I talked about that, a lot of people reached out saying that wherever they were living, the same thing was happening. So I literally got Yeah, I literally got every corner of the US, people from every corner of the US saying that the same thing is happening at their local targets. So that was cool. And I'm hoping that I was able to save some people money, uh, because who likes paying for more than they have to, right? Another episode that I got a lot of feedback on was the episode I did with recycling. A lot of people didn't realize that, uh, they didn't know I guess the state of recycling in this country, with what happened in China. China refusing to take any more plastics, and we no longer having a economic incentive to recycle, I guess. So yeah, just knowing that, I think the more people know, the better, because people's recycling bins, recycling bins at home are disappearing. One of my guests, Selena, actually mentioned that she thought that someone stole her recycling bin, but her city actually just canceled the recycling program. So that's why they took away the recycling bin that they normally would have put all their recycled goods, recycled trash into and put out. But yeah, it's gone because, yeah, the recycling program has stopped. And I think it's important for people to know that, so that we can try to figure out a new solution. Because if people don't know and they just think that, their recycling is going well and all that, then nothing can change, right? So it's those things that I really enjoy, being able to shed light to things that I learned that shock me, so that more people can know and more people can learn, and hopefully we can all bring about enough awareness to, yeah, make new, or actually come to new solutions. So those are the things I liked about the podcast. Some of the things I disliked about the podcast. One thing it's obvious is there are weeks where I am really tired, and there have been episodes that I recorded at 10 p.m. on a Friday night just to try to get it out by 12 a.m. And I mean, it's been hard. It was a challenge for sure. There, it's not always easy to talk or speak coherently about a single topic for that long without having someone else on the other side. So that's why, if you notice, all my solo episodes are only about 30 minutes long, because it's hard to talk to yourself and kind of try to guide a conversation by yourself. So yeah, especially when you're tired, right? So those days when I was super tired, not wanting to do the podcast, it was difficult, because it was challenging. It's not that I hated it, but it was definitely a challenge. Another thing I dislike is having to push myself outside of my boundaries, my comfort zones. So there was a moment when I decided I'm going to start having guests on the podcast. And after several weeks, I exhausted all of my friends that wanted to be on the podcast, that I was comfortable enough with, like, talking to and reaching out to. Because I am an introvert, even people that I know, if I'm not super close with them, I feel uncomfortable asking them for a favor, because coming on the podcast as a guest is definitely a favor for me, right? They're not really getting anything out of it. I'm getting content out of it. So they are definitely doing me a favor. So when I reach out to people that I don't know super well, it was always uncomfortable, and so I didn't like it. But I'm really glad that I was pushed to do these things that I didn't like. Um, Being challenged is a way of growth, so I really like it. So some of the guests that I wasn't super close to, but I went way out of my comfort zone to ask, is, so Jerry Yang. He was on the episode where he talked to us about his travel around the world, right? He took a year off and traveled the entire world. And I knew him. I would consider myself close to him because I spent an entire 2 semesters of college working very close with him for our senior project. But since I met him, since I saw him in Las Vegas when we ran into each other at the work conference, we don't really have consistent touch points in our lives. He lives in Marietta. I live in Swanee, so we don't go to the same church. There aren't many reasons for us to run into each other a lot. So when I contacted him about doing the podcast, it was I felt kind of bad. So Jerry, I don't know if you're listening, and I don't think I told you, but I really felt bad about asking him because I saw that he did this really cool thing, and I said it would be really cool to get his story. But yeah, you know that feeling like you almost are using somebody because you don't feel close enough to ask for a favor. So you feel like you're using somebody, but I just said whatever. If I keep thinking this way, then I'm never gonna be able to get more interesting content. So I said screw it, and I texted him through Instagram. I direct messaged him, and yeah, he was so nice. He was nice enough to come and talk with me. So yeah, another person is John Song. I felt really bad about that because I know how busy he is. Whenever I see a local musician in Atlanta come out with a new song, there's always a disclaimer. Oh, shout out to John Song for helping me out on this song, and things like that. So I know he's super busy. He's running his own company. He's doing music. So I felt bad reaching out to him, even though I went to church with him for a little bit several years back. He's one of those, again, I don't really have a whole lot of touch points to see him or run into him regularly. So and he kind of feels like a local celebrity to me. So it felt like I was kind of reaching beyond my reach. I don't know if that makes sense. It would be like if I were to contact a celebrity that I met like maybe once or twice and say, "Hey, you're a celebrity. Can you want to be on my podcast?" Like, it just felt like he probably wouldn't get anything out of it. It felt like I definitely got way more out of recording that podcast than he did. So I felt really bad. John Young, if you're listening, sorry, but thank you so much for being so nice. Thank you so much for coming on and recording. So yeah, all that to say, there are definitely guests that have been on this podcast. I'm trying to think of, any more that I wasn't super close to? Like Hyun. Hyun is, I mentioned that I met him through the podcast because he reached out because he listened and he wanted to talk. But I'm not super close to him, but I thought it would be interesting to have him on. So I got him on. Oh yeah, Andy. And at the time I first asked him to be on the podcast, I would say I was definitely not as close to him as I am now. So I felt bad about asking him too, because I pretty much ended up getting a free coaching session from him. And that's definitely a marketable thing. He can definitely charge people to do that kind of stuff. But because it was for the podcast, he did it for free. So yeah, I felt bad. I feel like I got way more out of that episode than he did. But I think another thing that it just helps me realize is that there are so many gracious people out there, so many people to thank regarding this podcast, because without all of my awesome guests, without all the people who've helped me, it wouldn't be where it is now. Another big shout out to Jim. He was a guest at least twice on the podcast. He was one of my very first guests, actually. But he helped me set up all of the equipment that I use. So for the first, I want to say 10 or so episodes, I did everything on my phone. Thanks to Anchor. I know I have the ad in the beginning of every episode. I stand by it. I really like Anchor. I think it's a really easy to use tool. platform. And especially if you're someone trying to start a podcast for the first time, it's really great. It's really helpful. But through Anchor, I did most of my first solo episodes on my phone, did all the recording and editing on that. But once I started entertaining the notion of having guests on, I needed to find an alternative. And Jim actually had a bunch of equipment lying around, and he let me borrow a lot of it still today. Yeah, he's the reason why I have good quality audio when I have guests. So yeah, thank you to Jim. And yeah, like I was starting to talk about, but I mentioned Jim first, is the fact that this podcast helped me realize how many gracious people there are around me. And I don't think a lot of people realize that there are probably a lot of people around you willing to help. But because we keep things to ourselves, people end up not being able to help. So just a word of encouragement to all you guys, or a piece of advice, is if you are pursuing a dream, if you want to do something and you're not quite sure how to start, or if you've started and you're not quite sure how to improve or get better at it, talk to people about it, because you don't know who out there is willing to help and able to help. Yeah, so I learned that about my community. There are so many people around who are super nice, super creative, super willing to share their talents, and to help other people out. Because again, that's what all of my guests have done. They've helped this podcast grow. They've helped this podcast be more interesting. So yes, big shout outs to all of my guests, all of my previous guests, and to all of my future guests. Because yeah, I guess that's a good transition to talk about the future of the podcast. Looking forward, there are several things that I think are gonna change with the podcast. One of those things is the look, the visual of the podcast. So I'm talking about the logo, kind of how I brand the podcast through different things like Instagram and things like that. So I had a brief conversation with a person. So I'm not going to talk about who that person is, because that's really all it was. It was just a brief conversation. But we might try to do a thing where we revamp the look of the podcast to have a better logo, because my logo is literally just a stock photo from Anchor, and I put the words "I hope they hear this" on it. So I put very little time or thought into coming up with it. So it would be nice to really sit down, think about the branding image I want to put out there. So yeah, it might happen with this person or not. Again, it was a very brief conversation I had, so I don't know if it'll happen or not, but I definitely do want to explore coming up with a, I guess, custom feel, custom look and logo for this podcast. Another thing is the theme music of this podcast is, again, it's a stock, or not stock, it's one of the provided music from Anchor. There's a lot, but there's nothing stopping any other podcast from using that. There might be many podcasts out there that are already using it. So again, I had a brief conversation with someone about coming up with, I guess, custom music for this podcast, custom theme music for this podcast. So we'll see where that goes. Again, it was a very brief conversation I had with someone, so I'm not going to divulge who that is. But if it goes well, then I'm hoping to have an intro, like a different intro song, different intro music. And I want an outro music as well. I think it's always awkward when I just end the podcast with, all right, guys, bye. And it goes to blank, so yeah, hopefully I can get those things done. And Another thing is, I know I had one episode in the past where I had multiple guests, but I think I want to do that more often. Because what I'm realizing is people have stories, right? Individual persons have stories, but when it's regarding one or two people, there's a whole different story between those two people, right? And I think those stories are worth telling as well. And I think I figured out the equipment where I can have more than one guest, because the limiting factor was the fact that I only had two mics, but I have more equipment now where I think I can have more than one guest. So yeah, look forward to that. Yeah. If there's anything in the past year, well, first of all, let me take time now to say thank you so much for everyone who've been listening to this podcast for the past year. You guys are awesome. I don't know. I wouldn't be doing this if no one was listening. I would be very sad if no one was listening. But I've met a lot of people through this podcast. People have approached me saying, "Oh, I heard your podcast and it was very interesting." And I'm really encouraged by that. I'm very inspired, very encouraged. So thank you everybody who've approached me about the podcast. And yeah, it's weird. I normally don't like people approaching me, but if it's about the podcast, I love it. It might be, maybe, is it egotistical? I don't know. But yeah, to all the people who've approached me because you recognize me from the podcast, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for giving me feedback. And I look forward to more. If you haven't given me any feedback, but you have thoughts on the podcast, please let me know, because I do take all of them into consideration. I might consider and ignore it, but I definitely do consider all of it, because not all feedback is something that I can incorporate. I'm trying to think of, but I don't think I have yet. There hasn't been a single. Yeah, I don't think there has been a message of feedback that I got that I didn't actively try to incorporate. So yeah, thank you guys so much for all the feedback. And again, I am asking for more. Please, if you have any feedback, please let me know. If you have any ideas for topics that you want me to cover in this new upcoming year, please let me know. And if you're someone who wants to share their story and you want to be a guest on this podcast and you would grace me with your presence and your telling of your story on this podcast, please let me know as well, because I'm always looking for more people's story to talk about, because I don't want this podcast to be just about stories of people I know, because that's so limiting, because I'm sure there are so many people out there who have stories worth telling and interesting stories that people would want to listen to. So yeah, that is my year recap of this podcast. I'm not gonna make another commitment for this podcast because I don't think it's necessary. I'm enjoying it enough that I'm sure I'll keep it going. But yeah, I look forward to the next year. I look forward to getting more feedback from you guys. And again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for listening. And I will talk to you next week with fresh new content and new people to talk to. Yeah. All right. Oh, one thing before I sign off is, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do so, because I am definitely going to be doing things that are specific to the video, because there are things I can't do just audio wise. So please subscribe if you don't want to miss out on it, because it's hard to, again, or at least follow me on Instagram, because that's where I make, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? I notify? Yeah, I notify you guys of everything that I'm doing. So if you don't want to miss out on those things, yeah, please follow me somewhere so that you can be held up to date. Not held up to date. If you can be kept up to date. Yeah. So another disclaimer. Now it's 11 p.m. on a Friday night. There were several guests that were supposed to be on the podcast that I was supposed to record with for this 52nd episode, but because of the holidays, their schedule and my schedule, I had to reschedule a lot of stuff, and a lot of the guests fell through. So that's actually why I'm doing a yearly recap instead of having a guest on. But I think it worked out because I did want to do something like this. But anyways, that is to say, if I rambled or if I repeated something more than once, it's because I'm very tired. It has been a lot of long days with family, doing New Year's, Christmas stuff. We recently started feeding our baby solid food, so it's been a mess. So I am very tired. So yeah, that is to say, please forgive me if I did any rambling or anything like that. But yeah, thank you guys for listening once again. I love you guys, and I will talk to you guys next week. Bye.